I was hiking in the mountains near my hometown when I stumbled upon an old abandoned airfield. The strange thing was that I'd hiked this trail many times before and never seen it. Curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to explore. The buildings were crumbling, and the place had an eerie, deserted feel to it. As I approached one of the hangars, I heard a low humming noise and saw bright light from inside. I cautiously peeked in and saw what looked like a futuristic aircraft, unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was sleek, with no visible engines or propellers. Suddenly, the aircraft began to glow, and a powerful force pulled me inside. The next thing I knew, I was standing outside the airfield, but something was different. The sky was darker and the air felt heavy. I hurried back to town, only to find everything changed. The buildings were older, the cars were outdated, and the people I recognized looked much younger. I quickly realized I had been thrown back in time, decades before my birth. Panicked, I ran back to the airfield, but it was gone, just an overgrown field with no sign of the structures I had seen. I was driving home late one night when I noticed a bright light in the sky. It hovered for a moment before shooting off at an impossible speed. Moments later, I saw the same light again, but this time it was closer. I kept driving, thinking it was just a trick of the light or fatigue. But then it happened a third time, the light now almost directly above me. I felt a strange sensation, like time was slowing down. Suddenly my car's engine died, and I coasted to a stop on the side of the road. The light descended, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my car, driving down the same stretch of road as before. I checked the time and realized that only a few seconds had passed. Yet I had a vivid memory of being somewhere else, somewhere cold and sterile, surrounded by beings that didn't seem human. I tried to shake it off as a hallucination, but then it happened again. The same light, the same sensation, the same blackout. Each time I woke up slightly further down the road, but with more memories of that strange place. It was like I was caught in a time loop, each iteration bringing me closer to something I wasn't sure I wanted to remember. While cleaning out my grandparents' attic, I found a dusty old photo album filled with black and white pictures. Most of them were ordinary family photos, but one caught my eye. It was a picture of a group of people standing in front of what looked like a flying saucer. The weird thing was, one of the men in the picture looked exactly like me, down to the clothes I was wearing that day. I was shocked and showed it to my grandmother. She stared at it for a long time before telling me that the photo was taken in the 1950s, long before I was born. My grandmother insisted she had no idea who the man in the photo was, but mentioned that her father had always talked about a strange encounter he had as a young man. He claimed that a UFO had landed near their farm, and a man who looked just like his future grandson had stepped out, warning them about a coming disaster. Shortly after, a tornado hit the area, destroying several homes. I took the photo with me, but no matter who I showed it to, no one could explain the uncanny resemblance. I started to wonder if at some point in the future, I would travel back in time and meet my own grandparents. I was driving through the desert on a road trip with some friends when we saw bright light in the distance. At first, we thought it was another car, but as we got closer, it became clear that it was something else, a glowing disc-shaped object hovering just above the ground. Without thinking, we decided to follow it. The object led us down a winding, deserted road that wasn't on our map. The further we drove, the more the landscape around us changed. The sky grew darker, and the stars seemed to shift in their positions. Time felt like it was stretching out, each minute lasting longer than the last. Suddenly, the object shot straight up into the sky and vanished, leaving us in total darkness. We tried to turn the car around, but the road was gone. We were surrounded by an endless expanse of desert. After what felt like hours, we finally saw headlights in the distance. A truck pulled up, and the driver asked if we needed help. We asked where we were, and he looked at us like we were crazy. According to him, we were nearly 200 miles away from where we had started, with no memory of how we got there. One evening, I was tinkering with an old shortwave radio that had belonged to my grandfather. I was scanning through the frequencies when I stumbled upon a strange broadcast. The voice on the other end was speaking in an unknown language, but occasionally, There were words in English, words like time, travel, and UFO. As I listened, the signal grew stronger, and I began to hear a series of numbers being repeated over and over. I wrote them down, thinking they might be coordinates or some kind of code. Then the voice stopped, and a different, clear voice came through. This one was in perfect English and sounded eerily familiar. The voice said my name and warned me not to go to a certain location at a specific time. It described a place I had never been to in a time that was days away. I was spooked, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to follow the instructions. On the day in question, I stayed home, but I couldn't resist checking the news later. Sure enough, there was a report of a mysterious explosion in the exact location I had been warned about. Witnesses claimed to have seen a UFO hovering just before the explosion. To this day, I have no idea how that voice on the radio knew my name or why it warned me, but I'm certain it saved my life. I was on a solo road trip, driving through the remote backroads of the American Southwest. The landscape was barren and desolate, with nothing but miles of desert stretching out in every direction. As evening approached, I realized I needed to find a place to stay for the night. I came across a small, seemingly forgotten town that wasn't on my map. The sign at the edge of town read Garrisonville, a name I had never heard of. The town looked like something out of the past, with old-fashioned storefronts and buildings that seemed frozen in time. I parked my car and walked down the main street, hoping to find a motel or a place to get something to eat. The town was eerily quiet, with no signs of life. The buildings were intact, but there was something unsettling about the place. Everything looked too perfect, too preserved, as if time had stopped. I finally found a small diner with the open sign in the window. I stepped inside and the bell above the door jingled, but the place was empty. I called out and a waitress appeared from the back. She was dressed in a retro uniform, like something out of the year 1950, and greeted me with a warm smile. We exchanged small talk, and I asked if there was a motel nearby. She nodded and gave me directions to a place just outside of town. I ordered a meal, and as I ate, I noticed something strange, the clock on the walls and moving. I asked the waitress about it, and she shrugged, saying it had been broken for as long as she could remember. Feeling uneasy, I quickly finished my meal and paid. I followed her directions to the motel, a quaint single-story building with a neon sign that flickered in the fading light. The man at the front desk checked me in without asking for any identification, and I was too tired to question it. That night I had strange dreams, visions of people moving in slow motion, their faces expressionless and their eyes vacant. I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. I decided to leave the town at first light. As I drove out of Garrisonville, I glanced back at the town in my rearview mirror. To my horror, the town was gone. There was nothing but empty desert behind me. I slammed on the brakes and got out of the car. But there was no trace of the town, no buildings, no sign, nothing. I drove for hours trying to make sense of what had happened. When I finally reached the next town, I asked around, but no one had ever heard of Garrisonville. I checked my map again, but there was no mention of it anywhere. I later learned that there had been a town called Garrisonville in that area, but it had been abandoned and forgotten decades ago. After a series of strange, unexplained events, some said it had disappeared completely, leaving behind only stories and rumors. To this day, I don't know what I experienced in Garrisonville, whether it was a time slip, a ghost town, or something else entirely. All I know is that I visited a place that shouldn't have existed, a town lost in time. I was visiting my grandparents' house, going through old photo albums with my grandmother. The album was full of black and white photos from the year 1950, capturing life in a small rural town. As I flipped through the pages, one photo caught my eye. It was a group shot of my grandmother with some of her friends at a local diner. What struck me as odd was the figure in the background, sitting alone at a booth. He was wearing modern clothing, a hoodie and jeans, and had a smartphone in his hand. The image was crystal clear, with the same grainy texture as the rest of the photo, but the man looked completely out of place. I asked my grandmother if she recognized the man, but she had no memory of anyone like that being around at the time. In fact, she didn't even know what a smartphone was until much later in life. Intrigued, I showed the photo to a few friends and even consulted a photography expert. They all confirmed the photo's authenticity, with no signs of tampering or digital manipulation. To this day, I have no explanation for the man in the photo, It's as if he had somehow traveled back in time, captured in a moment where he didn't belong. I've kept the photo, but every time I look at it, I can't shake the feeling that the man might be out there somewhere, perhaps even in our time, carrying the secret of how he ended up in that 1950 diner.